I first met in conjunction with the Genetic Support Network of Victoria. Heather is the president of SWAN, Syndromes Without a Name, and has had her own experience with dealing with and navigating the NDIS, and has now set up an organisation, Self-Management Support, to aid other members of the community looking to manage their own NDIS plans in achieving their goals in that regard. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Heather speak, and I'm sure a lot of you are as well.
Beautiful. No, that's right. Put my glasses on. Just go over here. Beautiful. No, I can read this. It's probably fine. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Nat. I don't know much about the audience, so has anyone actually got a plan for their child or for themselves? So not many. Okay, so sorry if you've heard this information before. I'll start. Oh, hang on, if I can press the button, or the mouse. So this one. Oh, on the keyboard. Sorry, we're running a bit. Oops. Beautiful. No, that's okay. Sorry. Now I've got it worked out. So this is basically a disclaimer. The NDIS is a ever-evolving scheme. Some people call it a beast. Some people think it's great. Things do change. They're changing all the time. They're asking for submissions all the time to make things better. In this presentation, my business partner Kate and myself have kind of put together what we think is important with pre-planning. And we strongly believe if you really think about what supports you want for the NDIS and you really go through the process, which I'll talk you through as the presentation goes on, then you've got the best chance of getting the plan that's going to support your child the best. So I've sort of divided this presentation into two bits. So one, we're going to talk about what is the NDIS, how you can access it, and the second section goes through the planning process. Now, I'm happy, if you've got any questions along the way, just put up your hand, because is that all right, Nat, if we take questions? Because otherwise you might forget. And if I know I'm covering it later on in the presentation, I'll just ask you to hold your question. So what is the NDIS? And this is taken straight from their website. The NDIS is a new way of providing individualised supports for people with disabilities, their families and carers. The NDIS will provide all Australians with a permanent and significant disability who are aged under 65 with the reasonable and necessary supports that they need to live an ordinary life. And it's based on the Act, so the whole NDIS Act, and that has rules around the Acts about how to interpret them, what they can do, what they can't do, and then there's operation guidelines as well. And there's links all to those on the NDIS website, or you can just do a Google search. So, and again, the eligibility. You have to be an Australian resident, you have to be under the age of 65, and you have to live in an NDIS area. Now, the NDIS is still rolling out, so there's many areas that haven't rolled out yet. Some have started to roll out, but can take 6, 9, 12 months for them to roll out completely. And you have to have a permanent disability which actually impacts your life. So if you just fall over and break your leg, you can't qualify for the NDIS if you're a typical person. Though there is the ability to meet, if you meet the early intervention requirements, to get into the scheme. So, how do you know whether it's your time to enter the NDIS? So you can look on the NDIS website, you can ring the NDIS. If you're in a defined program, so if your child goes to an adult day service or in early intervention, that's classified as a defined program, which gives you automatic entry to the NDIS. So if that's the case, you'll receive a letter from the NDIS or phone call saying, would you like to be a participant on the scheme? You don't have to be a participant, but then you won't get any supports unless you're self-funding it all yourself. So the old way of funding used to be block funded. So you'd get funding to attend a certain program, a certain day service, certain accommodation that you could stay in, and you had to use those services. The NDIS gives you the freedom, it's your package, you can take it anywhere in Australia and use it. So it's a lot more choice and control, and you're not limited by a day program finishing at 3 o'clock. So what will happen is once you've been accepted onto the scheme, you've got your letter saying, yes, you're in, blah, blah, blah. You'll get a phone call wanting to set up a meeting, and that meeting will be with a LAC, which is a local area coordinator, or NDIS planner. And they'll sit down with you and develop a plan. It's really important to understand what reasonable and necessary is. And I'm going to keep coming back to it, because if it's not reasonable and necessary for your child to be supported, reach their potential, build their capacity, it's not going to be funded. So it's got to be for the person to pursue their goals and objectives. So if they want to work towards living away from home, then that's a goal that will be supported. If they want to find a job, that will be supported. If they want to develop the capacity to engage in their community, you know, to play at the local bowls club, but they can't get there without a support person taking them, that will be supported. You know, they really want people with disabilities to enjoy an ordinary life like everyone else can. The supports that they fund have to be related to the disability, and it's also got to show value for money. It's an insurance scheme. They want to see they're getting bang for their buck. So if they don't think it's going to be good value for money and it's going to increase your capacity to do something, they're not going to fund it. And it has to be effective and work. There's no point trying, you know, something that's not going to build someone's capacity and it's not going to work, or it might set them backward. They won't fund that either. And they will ask you to consider other support. So if the support is better funded by the healthcare system or education system, or informal supports within the family, and the family's able to do some of these supports, they won't fund that either. So when you're building a case for what you want funded, you have to ask yourself the question, is this funded better by another service? So, for instance, they won't fund a doctor's appointment because that's funded by the Department of Health under Medicare. So just bear in mind, because if it's funded by a better department, they won't fund it. We've had people put in psychology and they're not going to fund it because they'll say, go and fund that under the mental health care plan. That's what that's there for. There's ways around it, and I can give you some examples later on. But you can look up, I think it's section 32 of the Act, it describes what reasonable and necessary is. What your current living arrangements are. So that's like, are you living at home with mum and dad? Are you in a support accommodation? What are your informal and formal supports? So your informal supports would be things like your family, and your formal supports might be, you know, the place you go to school or to work. Think about what's working well. So if your child's doing fortnightly speech therapy and that's working well and you're ticking off those goals, that's really good. But if your child isn't accessing any speech therapy at the moment because of financial restraints, and you think, well, this is going to make a big difference, that's something you want to change. So you'd be asking for that in your plan. And what activities and services would you like? So if you'd like your 15-year-old to be able to go to the gym, but they're not able to go by themselves, you could think, well, look, if they had a support worker, they could accompany them to the gym, and that would be a way they could access their local community like a typical 15-year-old. And what supports you would like. So people have different ideas. Ask your children, you know, what would you like to do? You know, would you like to be able to swim at your local swimming club? And would you like to go to a dance class? Now, if it's a typical child, they won't fund the dance class because they'll say, well, a typical parent would pay for dance lessons, but they will fund a support person to take that child there and accompany them if need be in that dance class. And think about your goals. So you might have the goal for my child is to be able to dress themselves. So you might work with an OT and the first thing you're going to do is, learn to put your top on the right way. And then you might build up to tying your shoelaces. And they're little short measurable goals that you can measure along the way to reach your overarching goal of independence and the child dressing themselves. So you've got to be really clear about what you want and know about what you want. I'd say I'd spend an average between 3 and 6 hours doing someone's pre-planning, because you've got to really be clear about what you want. So you think about what you want, you think about how am I going to get there, what are the goals I need to do to get there, what supports are going to get there, and what's the overall outcome. And is it a reasonable and necessary thing to support with the NDIS? Again, going back to knowing what the NDIS will fund, reasonable and necessary. There's a NDIS pricing guide. Has anyone looked at that? Yeah. So the NDIS pricing guide basically tells you all the supports the NDIS fund. Now, they do fund things out of that pricing guide, but the majority of things are funded in that pricing guide. And there's also an assistive technology pricing guide, which leads things like home modifications, and other bits of equipment that the NDIS fund. And that's divided into 3 sections, which I'll go into a bit later. But you could almost use that as a bit of a shopping list. It's like, so they fund speech therapy. Yes, now that will help us achieve Jamie being able to pronounce things more clearly, or being able to actually go to a cafe and order off a restaurant menu because he can articulate what he wants. So the pricing guide and the NDIS is divided into 3 areas. So your core supports, your capital supports, and your capacity building supports. So your core supports might be social and community inclusion, so accessing your local area. Your capital supports might be home modifications, and your capacity building are things that will grow your potential to be able to live an ordinary life. So it might be occupational therapy, it might be funding, a social group so you can improve your communication skills. It might have something to work toward independent living. So if you go to the pricing sheet, it's about it's about 65 pages long. It gives you a description of everything, and you'll see what's typically funded under the NDIS. And if you think there's something that's not on the pricing sheet that you think you could be funded, you need to ask the question, is it reasonable and necessary? And then you can talk to the planner and say, look, I think this is really crucial to my child's development. Is there a way it can be funded under the NDIS? So be prepared, a participant statement. Some planners will say, can you write a participant statement? So that's about the participant entering the scheme. So you might say, my name's Jane, I live at home, I have 2 brothers and sisters, I have 1 cat, I attend X school, and it's all about you. And it might talk about the supports that you're in place. So, 2 nights a week, I go to after-school care, 1 night a week I go to speech therapy, the other night I go to dance class. And you're basically telling it how it is. Now, it may be that you could say, up until the NDIS, I haven't had the opportunity to build these skills because of financial impacts. I haven't been able to afford this, but this is what I really want to do. You could say, I want to, learn to ride a bike. That's my aspiration. So then when the planner reads that participant statement, it gives them a good background as to where the person is now and what they want to aspire to. And then there's a carer statement. So that's about you as the parents, and tell it how it is. So they do take time to write the participant statement, and they like them from the first person. So it's a bit of a mix, because when I wrote mine, my child would not articulate or speak like I would put in a participant statement. So it's up to you whether you want to write it in the 3rd person or 1st person, but now they're saying they should be written 1st person. I don't understand why, but that's what they're saying. So the carer statement, so you could say things like, I care for my 3 children, my second child has a disability which has a flow-on impact to my other children, they suffer anxiety because of result of their siblings' disability, I have my own mental health problems because of depression, I've struggled to deal with this, or I care for my 82-year-old aged mother, and that puts a strain on us. And you could say, I don't have any supports in place, no family support, or you could say, I've got a great sister down the road and she comes and visits 3 days a week and helps me care for my child. So tell it how it is, don't lie, but a lot of carers really struggle, and the NDIS has made a big difference to them going forward. Oops, sorry. Any clues? Any questions about the carer's statement or participant statement? Glad it's not just me.
No.
That's not touch screen. Up. That one. Yep. Goals.
I wonder if I can. Will that start from beginning or start from current slide?
Start from current slide.
Yeah, I might get you to.
Okay, up there. Oh, okay. Yep. That's right. Yep. Oh, it's not up here though.
No. Sorry, I just can't see to move the mouse.
Oh, sorry. No.
Current slide.
Let's see. I'll start from current. Hang on. Sorry. All right, there we go. Thank you. Sorry. No, that's okay. So developing goals. When you get a plan, it will have generally 2 short-term goals and then some long-term goals and aspirations. So, the short-term goal might be, to learn to get myself dressed, and the long-term goal will to become independent. So you need to do the short-term goals to get to the long-term goal of living independently, being able to dress yourself, feed yourself. So what I tend to do is break it all down. So I think, well, if I want a speech therapy to work on articulation, we want to work on that so we can eventually go out to the community and order a coffee at a cafe like everyone else. So the short-term goal would be work on articulation. The long-term goal would be able to access the local community and communicate our needs. They need to be realistic and they need to be relevant to your child and specific for you. So everyone's NDIS plan is going to be different depending on your needs and where your child is at that point in time. And look, particularly when children are young, they change very quickly. Sometimes they grasp concepts really quickly. Sometimes you're still working on tying shoelaces 3 years later. And your plan should really reflect your goals. So what I tend to do is say to the therapist who's working with your child, what goals do you think we should be working on with little Jane? And you'll know your child better than anyone else. The speech therapist, having worked with your child for a while, will know what they think's achievable. There's a great resource on their Valid website, which is helpful for therapists in writing support letters. So I would encourage you, once you've thought about what you want for your child, have that conversation with your therapist, ask them to write a letter of support, and that becomes evidence when you go to have your NDIS meeting. You're much better getting letters of support from therapists, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Actually, it's probably the next slide. Because it's evidence that it's going to be worthwhile funding that piece of equipment or support. Instead, it's an insurance-based scheme. They're not just going to hand out money left, right and centre. They want to make sure they're getting value for money. So if working on articulation is eventually going to get little Jane being able to order a coffee in the community, they think, well, that's a good investment, and we invest now, it's going to pay off in the future, and we won't hopefully not have to support that speech therapy, 5 years from now. So work with your specialists. If they have no idea on how to write a letter of support for the NDIS, point them to the Valid website. They've done a great resource in saying, well, think about goals, articulate what you want. I think it's really good if they can measure where your child is now and then 9 months' time, when you go into the review process, you sit down with your therapist and go, well, have we achieved this, this, this? Then ask yourself, well, why haven't we achieved this? And it might be, you know, little Jane took longer to learn. We think we need another year to work on this skill to develop this goal. And then you've got something to measure with the NDIS. So, well, we were here, we've done all this work, and we're now here, and now we think we're going to work towards some new goals, or we're going to keep working on this goal. And if you have the evidence, you're more likely to get the support you want because you've got the evidence backing it up. I'm not saying people haven't got it without evidence. I just think the more prepared you are, the better plan you're going to get, because you don't want to be going through a review process. And I'll talk about that a bit later on. So, funding. Does anyone who's got a plan self-manage their funding? No? Plan manage? NDIS manage your plans. Okay, so there's 3 ways. So you can use the agency, and that's in a lot of ways the easiest way to do it. You don't have to worry about paying invoices, doing, choosing, well, you can choose your therapist, but they have to be NDIA registered. So you don't get as much choice and control, but if the therapist you're using is already NDIA registered, then that's easy. And it just sort of ticks along and you don't have to worry about anything. With plan management, I sort of think of plan managers more like an invoice payer. Often a plan manager might have an accounting background or bookkeeping background, and they pay your invoices on your behalf. So the speech therapist will send them an invoice, they'll send it to you, you go, yes, we did do that session, tick it off, and then the plan manager will upload that to the NDIS MyGov portal, and they'll pay it on your behalf. The advantage of plan management, it gives you more choice and control. So you can use, you know, your local gym. So if your child's accessing the local gym's not an NDIA provider, you can still utilise that service. You're not bound by and limited by NDIA providers. And self-manage gives you the most choice and control. It can be a bit overwhelming until you get your head around it, because you're responsible for service agreements, you're making sure your therapists are paid on time. If you employ support workers, you're responsible for paying them or using an agency such as Hire Up to pay them on your behalf, or using an app that is a timesheet app, come pay app. There's different ways you can do it. They say probably about, I think it's about 70 to 80% of people are using NDIA to manage their NDIS plan. And I think a lot of that is it's a new scheme. People just want to see what it's all about. Self-management, I think they're saying it's about 7 or 8%, and they're hoping that will grow. I think they originally said they were hoping about 35% would self-manage their plan, because it just cuts down on a lot of fees for the agencies. Also, you can determine what rate you want to pay if you self-manage. The pricing guide caps the rates from the NDIS, but if you're self-managing, you can pay above that. It just means you've got less out of your plan to spend on that support. So what about has anyone got any questions about managing their plan? They'll ask you at the planning meeting, how do you want to manage your plan? And you can do a combination as well. So when you get your plan, it'll say NDIS will provide fund my support organisation for this support, or NDIS will pay me directly for these supports. So you can do a bit of both. You might go, well, I want to keep all my therapists NDIA, so I don't have to worry them, but I want to self-manage my support workers. The planning meeting, they'll ask you whether you want a face-to-face meeting, and sometimes the planner will come to your house, sometimes you go to their office, sometimes they will do a phone meeting. I would strongly recommend you do a face-to-face meeting, just because you lose so much communication over the phone. Sometimes people like to have their child at the planning meeting. Sometimes the child's too much of a distraction. So what I tend to do is, because I couldn't do anything with my child, she'd be running amok, I take photos. So I might take a photo of my child having a tantrum on the footpath, or some people show videos of their child, having a meltdown, or a child speaking so the planner can actually hear how difficult it is for the child to master language. They'll give you a questionnaire, so depending on your child and the plan, it's called like a pedicad, or they'll do a family questionnaire, and they'll ask you things like your child, can they climb upstairs? So that's often how they'll start the meeting off. You have the right to bring a support person with you. Some people do these planning meetings by themselves. Some people bring an advocate. Some people bring their speech therapist. Some people just bring their partner. Some people bring a friend. I think it's really useful because, particularly if you've got someone who knows your child, because you're emotionally attached to your child, you're in the meeting, and you can't always think objectively, whereas if you've got someone who knows your child, they can go, oh, but remember, you couldn't leave Johnny alone because they just eat toilet paper. And you might have forgotten because that's just your everyday life. But for this person, they've clicked, oh, yes. And that means to the planner, this child needs support. So I would strongly recommend you bring someone. I would try and get your plan right the first time and avoid a review because reviews are time-consuming. You've got if you're not happy with your plan, you've got 3 months to lodge an internal review. So you fill in a review of a reviewable decision form. And it's basically your chance to say, this support wasn't funded that I asked for. I think it should be funded. Here's the evidence. Could you please reconsider? And it'll be someone who hasn't done your original plan will look at that internal review. Now, the NDIS you've got 3 months to lodge that. The NDIS have what they call, it's not flexible time. They will do it when they have time to do it, basically. So when it's reasonable for them to look at it, they will look at it. I lodged an internal review in December and I finally had the meeting in, I think it was end of February, and then I got my plan out of my internal review in April. So it was quite a process. And once you get a new plan from a review, it starts afresh from that plan. They can take things out of your plan. I actually lost funding from my internal review. The reason I did an internal review is because funding was allocated to areas it shouldn't have been. So we got respite through our local council. When we rolled out, our council said we're not going to be a respite provider anymore with tax services. So in my plan, that funding was funded in kind to Darebin Council, whereas the funding should have come to me because it was my plan. I was self-managing and they weren't an NDIS provider and refused to take people who were self-managing their plan because they're moving away to aged care. So little things like that. We got one of the first plans because we're now on to our third plan in Darebin. So try and avoid a review is what I say. If you're really not happy with your plan, of course, lodge an internal review. And then once you've got your new plan and you're still not happy with it, you've got 28 days to lodge it to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And what they do is they actually sit down at a bit of mediation beforehand and try and stop it going to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal because that costs money. And then if you're still not happy with it, then you can take it up to the federal court. As I said, it's much easier if you get it right the first time, which is why pre-planning is so important because it's stressful too. And I've seen some shocking plans and people have just gone in and said, oh, I thought the NDIS would do the right thing. I didn't think I need to pre-plan. And you're talking about $4,000 plans with complex child, not going to cut it. Doesn't even fund 1 hour a week of a support worker. You hear children with really complex needs getting $40,000, not going to cut it for their needs. There's a lot of inconsistency of plans and often it comes down to how well you've done the pre-planning, your planner on the day. And I think with rare conditions it's a little bit more difficult. They're not automatically entry on the operation guidelines. Planners would have no idea about rare conditions. And my daughter's got a rare genetic condition. And what I did was put a fact sheet together, very simple dot point. Because of her disability, her genetic condition, this is the disability and this is how it impacts her life in dot points. You can't even guarantee they're going to read it, but at least you've given it to them. And I think it's just too abstract for them. And, you hear different stories. I've heard stories that, a planner's asked someone, so how long have you had Down syndrome for? Or when's your MS going away? And these are true stories. Or is 2 years old too young to employ a speech therapist? So some of these planners have no disability training, and there's a lack of training with LACs and NDIS staff. So I think you've just got to be one step in front. They are getting better. It's a new scheme, it's going to have issues, and the government keeps asking for feedback. I just did an assistive technology and a IT submission a couple of weeks ago, saying this is what's wrong. The pricing guide headings and the portal headings and the plan headings don't speak the same language. You have daily living, you have daily life, and you have daily activity. They all mean the same thing, but there's three different languages. So it will get better. It's a huge challenge to have a scheme like this. Nowhere else in the world has done such a social scheme. So do you have a question? Yes. So if you're level 3 autism, you automatically get in. Down syndrome. If you want to see what conditions get in, it's on the operational guidelines. So, but rare diseases aren't there. I keep putting it on my submissions, but they don't. They just say, well, it's needs-based. It's not diagnosis-based. But I think it's harder if you have a rare disease, and that needs to change. So I think we need to do what we can to help them out. Put a cheat sheet. This is how my condition impacts me. So what does your plan look like? When you get your plan, you'll get a cover letter, and that'll say that your plan's been approved. It'll say how your plan's going to be managed, whether you can self-manage, whether the NDIA are going to manage it with your plan manager. One thing I would suggest you put in, if you've really got no idea what you're doing with your plan, is ask for support coordination. So does anyone know what a support coordinator does? No? So in theory, LACs are funded for 10 hours of support coordination to work with you once you get your plan. In practice, it may or may not happen, just depending on how busy they are. So a support coordinator is someone who could say, they'll interpret your plan for you, and you could say, look, I'm looking for an all-inclusive cooking course. So your support coordinator will go away and hopefully give you a few options, say, well, you could try cooking course A, B or C. So they help you find services. They can also help you, when you get to the 9-month mark, about preparing for your next plan. And it's just as important to prepare for your next plan as it is your first plan. And so when you get to that 9-month mark, you'll have to say, what's working well in my plan? What isn't working well? What would I want to change? Why haven't I spent this funding? And it might be that you can't find the services. So, it might be something like you're looking for a human relationships course, but there's not any being offered in the time periods you can attend for your child. So just bear in mind that, I know you haven't even got on your first plan, but it comes around really quickly, and there's a push to have longer plans because it's such a strain on your resources. As a parent, you spend a lot of hours preparing for your next plan. Then you've got to ask therapists for reports. They charge you for those reports, which you can claim through NDIS if you're already on a plan. And it's got to change because it's not sustainable. But at the moment, most of the plans are 12 months plans. They did do a few 2 years plans, but they've stopped doing that. So, look, it's a case of watch this space. I think they will realise even like sitting down with a planner is 12 months is expensive because they've got to provide a planner to do that with. So you'll have your cover letter, you'll have about me, and that'll say, I live at home, these are my formal supports, this is my informal supports, what your goals are, what you do. So you can actually ask them to dump your individual participant statement and your carer statement into your plan, because that's basically what they reflect. Or they might go, well, look, I'm just going to do an abridged version, but I'll upload your full version so they can reference it. And it'll talk about your support budget. So It'll list all your supports. So core funding, it might have community and social access, and they'll give you a dollar figure like $5,000 or something. So you can look at your plan and you know what supports have been funded and what hasn't. They won't give you a reason why they haven't funded it. They might tell you that if you go for a review meeting, or you could ring up your planner afterwards and say, look, I really thought I'd get short-term accommodation funded. Why wasn't that funding funded? Is anyone looking at special disability accommodation for their child? No? Okay, I won't go into that then, because that's another challenging area to get funded. And once you get it funded, finding the resource for it. So this is basically what your plan will look like. It's divided into the 3 sections. And I've actually listed what they are. So core funding is assisted with daily life, transport, consumables, assistance with social and community participation. Your capital is your assist with technology, your home modifications and accommodation, and your capacity building. With young children, they tend to fund a lot more capacity building than the core, just because children are learning and developing all the time. So that's where you'd ask for your support coordination. You'd ask for, if your child had a lot of behavioural difficulties, you'd ask for it under improved relationships, and improved daily life is where your therapy would go. And you can find an overview of that on the pricing sheet as well, and they talk about it on the NDIS website. The NDIS website's a really good resource to go to. It's not always easy to search things on it. Sometimes I think it's easier to search on Google than the actual portal itself, on the NDIS website itself. But it will list what a reasonable and necessary support is. It will, talk about value for money, what's good value for money. So if you're not familiar with it or you've never been with it, I would go to it. It's also got a good NDIS My Pathways. It talks you through the process. There's a few organisations that have really good planning tools, and on the next slide I've got a list of resources. Amaze have a really good planning tool getting ready for the NDIS, and you actually go through a questionnaire. And I think sometimes as a carer you forget how much you do for your child. So it'll say, can your child wash themselves? Can your child dry themselves? For things, you're just so entrenched in doing things, you actually forget and go, oh, well, actually, a typical 9-year-old can dry themselves. And then it spits out a couple of goals at the end of it, so that's useful. Association for Children with Disability have a handbook you can work through. Carers Australia have a good checklist about what you do as a carer, think about it. And, things like mapping out, a diary for the week. This is what my child does here. I'd encourage you to do that. So you actually go, oh yeah, my child does do all this. And if they say, well, your child's doing something every night of the week, we might only fund 1 therapy session a month because we don't think you'll fit it in. So just be really clear in your head about what your child's doing, what's working, what you want to change. So tips for planning. I've spoken about the participant statement and carer statement, professional reports. Most of the therapists and doctors are used to writing reports now. They probably have a standard template they tweak depending on the person, so they're not going to be shocked if you ask them for a letter of support. And if they've really got no idea, point them to the valid guidelines. Bring someone to your planning meeting. Sometimes planning meetings can get quite emotional too. Sometimes they're quite upsetting. No one likes to think of the negative things about their child. So, just be aware it is an emotional time. Know what you want, and I said spend, minimum 3 hours thinking about your pre-planning. It takes time. Depending on the complexity of the child, it might take 6 hours. And then you've got to chase up all the reports, make sure you're happy with the therapist's reports. If you're not happy with them, go back to your therapist and say, look, actually, I don't think this is quite accurate, or actually, you remember we said we wanted to work on this goal. And if you've got a good relationship with them, they'll happily change them to reflect what you want to support your goals. Think about the type of meeting you want. Look, you might be a really busy person and go, right, I just want to do it on the phone, my child's not that complex, I think I can just do it. Or you might say, no, actually, I don't want the person coming to my house because they might judge that my house is a disaster zone. I'd prefer to go into an office. Or other people might go, no, I want them to come to my house. I want them to see the hoist. I want to see that my child's, run amok and there's mess everywhere, because that's what it is. We struggle to clean our house day in, day out because our child just destroys things. And familiarise yourself with the NDIS website. I can't emphasise that enough. Just, I'm not asking you to read the Act, the rules, the operation guidelines, but you can read parts of it. And most of those are on the NDIS website, such as what is a reasonable and necessary support. And if you don't understand, ring up the NDIS and say, look, I'm still trying to get around this. Can you help me? The other thing I would do is encourage you to go to the community workshops on the NDIS. So NDIA runs some, sometimes Brotherhood run them, sometimes ACD run them, different organisations run them. Sometimes they like you to attend, 4 sessions. It's a big ask. Sometimes they're only 2-hour sessions. You get different things out of different ones. Now, I've sat through some of them and I just thought, you've given me wrong information. So you've really got to be a bit picky and choosy about which ones you attend. I think it's good to attend a variety, and then you can go, right, well, I picked that up from that one, that from that one. I probably went to about 4 different ones by different organisations before I got on my plan, and then I sort of pulled all that knowledge and put it into this cutting through the guff presentation, because some of them were like, oh, just get this over. It was just a waste of time, the same thing over and over again. So yeah, have a think about that. Talk to people who've on plans. What worked well for you? What would you do differently? Why do you think that support wasn't funded? If you've got similar children, really the plans should be quite similar if they're going for similar goals. There's nothing, you can't beat talking to someone who's gone through the planning experience as well. If your child's really complex, I would be asking for a senior planner for your planning meeting, someone who's got a bit of experience about disability or chronic health conditions. Remember, you're your child's best expert, so don't doubt yourself. You know your child better than anyone. You'll have a better understanding of, what you think they can do, what you'd like them to do, what they want to do, and be prepared. And I really think people who go in really prepared get better plans than people who don't. It doesn't always follow, but probably 80 to 90% of the time it does. And it's easier for the planner too if you can go in and go, right, this is my pre-plan. They've got it all documented. They can't forget to write it down at a meeting because you've given them a piece of paper with that on it. And once you get access to the portal, you can actually upload, this is what I gave to the planner. So there's no denying it. I haven't gone into the portal now, but if people do want to, are thinking of self-managing, they need to register for MyGov account and link a bank account to their MyGov account. And I label a bank account, my daughter's NDIS bank account. So it's all in the one, it's all separate. And I've listed useful resources. There's a few Facebook groups. You might have heard of the grassroots discussion. It's not always accurate, the information that's put on there. There's often quite disgruntled people on there, so just be wary of it and just take what you want out of it. Every Australian Counts have information on their website, Disability Loop, Peer Connect. I'd go to the NDIS website, have a look at their pathways document, work through that, and I've mentioned ACDs and amazes. Does anyone have any questions, or have I totally overwhelmed you? It is an overwhelming process to begin with. It does get easier each plan you do because you know more about how to ask for things, what you want to ask for. I love talking to people who have kids who are older than my daughter. Go, oh, well, what have you been working on? You've got to have those conversations as well. Yeah. Sure.
I've just got one statement. A lot of people I know are already on their plans, and we've been advised not a capital NOT to do over-the-phone ones at any cost, because you don't know who you're getting, and they often trick you to get tricky with your questions. Face to face is the best way to go.
I totally agree with that.
It can be anywhere. You can decide where it can be. It can be your home, the office. It can be a coffee shop. It can be a library. Anywhere you want, they have to go.
Yeah, I think it's good to do somewhere where there's no distractions. Absolutely, and we would discourage phone meetings. And there's been cases where people have rung up planners and, like you said, trick people, and the participants going, well, you know, this isn't the planning meeting. So you've got to be careful, because sometimes they'll try and do the questionnaire over the phone before the actual planning meeting. Sorry?
Sometimes they don't tell you it's actually the planning. They ring up and they say,
Yep.
don't answer.
Well, so sometimes they'll try. Yeah, no, that's good. And look, I think there's still a lot of people who have no idea about the NDIS, and they think, oh, you're trying to sell me insurance, because they're not always clear with their phone calls. And I said, I would always encourage a face-to-face meeting, because you lose too much communication on the phone. But everyone is different, and it is a choice. If you would prefer a phone meeting, it's entirely up to you. So, but I hear what you said. I would never do a phone meeting. I would always ask for a face-to-face. Any more questions? No? Sure.
Or have clarified the things that you've spoken about today. You've spoken about from a parent's perspective, but a lot of the concepts that you're talking about would relate to an adult looking to get an NDIS plan as well.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. So if you were looking for an adult getting a plan, you would be looking at employment options and how you can work towards employment options, or how you can work towards further study options, or how you can work to actually moving out of home into supported disability accommodation. The thing with disability support accommodation, there's actually not enough housing for it. A lot of the government have sold off a lot of supported disability accommodation. So if you want to get it, you almost have to say why regular housing isn't going to be suitable. You know, it might be, well, I've applied for 10 houses, but none of them are wheelchair accessible, or they've got stairs and that's not going to be suitable. And it's like, if you want psychology funded, you've got to almost say why mental health care plan isn't going to work. So if it's better funded by another department, forget it. They're not going to fund it, because they've got rules that they have to use to interpret the Act. So if the Act says it, that's law. So you have to follow that. Any more questions? I don't even know how I went for time.
Perfect timing.
Oh, good.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I don't think I did Heather justice in her introduction, but Heather has a wealth of knowledge, and you're staying for lunch?
Yes.
And we'll be around during the break if you do decide that you do have questions.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Heather.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay. Just a couple of things before we break for lunch, and the first is that here at CTF I have been writing some letters for families or individuals to support them in their NDIS applications or reviews. So that's something that you can have a chat to myself, Daniel, who's down here, who'll be based in Brisbane, and Mona in the head office about should you need that extra assistance. As Heather mentioned, you know, doctors and therapists are going to be the best source of information for you, but we can do a broad, overarching letter that sets out, you know, the impacts of NF and, you know, what, you know, might be an issue if funding's not put in place for you or your child. So have a chat to us about that, and hopefully NDIS is something that we'll cover in more detail down the track. But it is time for lunch, thank goodness, I'm starving. So what we'll do is head back up to the tea room where we were before. Lunch is provided today, so please feel free to join us. I will make sure that the MCRI research sign-up sheet is available down here at the registration desk. or we'll create a list if I can't find the one I've made. We'll join back here at 2:10 to hear from Carla Anderson from Able Australia, followed by a couple of other fantastic talks for the afternoon. So thank you very much.